Good morning, everyone. It's wonderful to be here in South Africa. I've been at the original launch of the global study, the shorter version in New York and the bigger version in Geneva, but nothing makes me happier than to be here in South Africa at this regional launch. It's been a long journey, and I think what's so exciting now is that we've got this, and we can say that that's only the beginning. Because really the work that has to be done is all ahead of us. It's all about how do we now take the recommendations and move forward with them. But it's important to look at a regional level. What came out of the global study, and I'm going to be focusing mostly on promising practices, because I think that also really helps to show the way about how we can do cross-country learning, how we can look at examples where things are improving, and so we can get one foot up on our stairway that we have to go to reach a better situation for children deprived of their liberty. Now, as you will remember from Manfred's presentation, the questionnaire was sent out to states parties all over the world. From this region, we received questionnaire responses from Madagascar, Mauritius, South Africa, Tanzania, Zimbabwe. From the DRC, we received a reply from the National Human Rights Institution, not from the government itself. And as you'll see with some of them, we received from both NGOs and from states. Other recent information from sources that were verifiable were also used in the global study. And you'll see if you look into the larger study in particular, from the footnotes you can see that literature was used, peer-reviewed literature, reports to the various human rights committees have been used, and concluding observations from the committees and so on. So this kind of information was considered sufficiently reliable to also look at. And I should also say something about the fact that when we started out at the beginning, counting seemed like a very big part of what we were doing. In other words, how many children are in what forms of deprivation of liberty. And as time went on, I think we realized, first of all, the difficulty of doing this when so many states capture their data in different ways and make it difficult to make any comparisons. And also that unless you look at numbers within the context of populations or child populations, they really don't mean very much. So they have very little value. But nevertheless, it was still very important to try to do that, and the global study has attempted to come up with the numbers. But what we realized as time went on was that the lived experience of children was hugely important, and that documenting that was just as important as counting children, maybe more. And also that promising practices were helpful in seeing the way that we could chart a pathway forward. So I'm focusing, as I said, not on numbers for the most part, but rather on those positives. As far as the administration of justice is concerned, we received that report from the Democratic Republic of Congo, which told us that there'd been training for police officers there, which helped police to engage with children, including with children who are living in street situations, in ways that allowed children to be referred away from the criminal justice system to child protection authorities. As far as Zambia is concerned, we learned from a reliable source that an arrest, reception, and referral center based on the one-stop justice center model, which is from South Africa, has been established to ensure that all children are brought to one central police station, and this makes it much easier to provide resources to them, so that if you've got only a certain number of probation officers or care workers, you're not having to send them off to lots of different places. You've brought them all to one. You can bring all the children from the different police stations to one, and then you can provide for far more specialized treatment and care. South Africa reported that cooperative work between different government departments and involving civil society role players is a very important feature of a successful child justice system, and that this played a huge role in the reduction of the numbers of children in prison from 3,757 down to 242 in 2018. This was actually mentioned by the Deputy Minister in her speech this morning as well. Now, it's going to be really important, I think, going forward to unpack how that was done. How was that managed and succeeded in? Well, part of it certainly was the Child Justice Act, which was introduced in 2008, and it is a holistic system based on restorative justice principles that focuses on diversion and so on. And it also has rules that actually really structure the discretion of presiding officers in the courts in deciding to deprive a child of their liberty. So if they're below 14, they cannot deprive them of their liberty. And if they are charged with certain crimes, they cannot deprive them of their liberty. So it narrows it down to a very small point where deprivation of liberty can be used. Legal representation for all children is also provided in South Africa. And there have been a number of test cases in the courts brought by civil society. And we've also seen this too in other SADC countries, Kenya notably, where the courts have been used as a way of resolving particular knotty problems in the system as well. I just want to show you what those figures look like from the year 2001. So it is a 20-year process going down from 3752, was it? 3757 down to 242. And another interesting thing here is the bar on the left, red, is awaiting trial or pre-trial, pre-sentencing. Okay. The purple is sentenced children. The orange is the total of the two. So you can easily see the total going down, 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 down. And remember the Act came into operation around about 2008. So we can see it continues, but it started before. So some things were going right before as well. The other interesting thing to note is that the red line, which shows children awaiting trial, were more than children sentenced in 2001, 2004, 2007. And after the Child Justice Act was put into operation, that turns around. And children awaiting trial are now fewer than children who are sentenced. And this is actually hugely significant because we shouldn't be keeping children deprived of their liberty awaiting trial if they're not going to end up serving a sentence. That is actually a very inappropriate use of deprivation of liberty. So we should really, if you think about it, adults get out on bail when they're awaiting their trials. Why were we always seeing this pattern before where there was just too much resort to deprivation of liberty in the early stages? So I've dwelt a little bit on it, and I could be accused of doing so because I'm South African and it's a good example, but actually I think it's also because it tells us things. We just need to dig down more to find out precisely what the building blocks are that can allow for that to happen. From Malawi, we've heard about the courts. Now I'm moving on to children of parents facing deprivation of liberty, and we've heard a lot about that this morning, and I'm very pleased about that. I said to Kiara, who led the drafting on this, she must have been so happy listening to Albie Sachs talking about this theme, because it's often the theme in deprivation of liberty that gets put off to the edge. It's the one about babies, and what is it again? Is it children in prison? Is it parents of imprisoned? So there. We really heard it put front and center, and Benyam echoed that as well in saying how important that is, and that it's the special feature of the African Charter as well, which actually was a very important part of the argument in the Constitutional Court case too. So here we see that in Malawi, the courts have been applying the best interest principle for a long time, since 2007, which is actually the same year as S versus M. Dixon and another was a case where the court confirmed in a bail case that a child, the fact that the mother had a baby was a compelling reason why she should be released on bail. And then there have been a series of other cases coming up to a most recent one in 2015 that also highlight this as well. I'm not even going to try and talk about S versus M because nobody can do it better than Albie Sachs. Mauritius provided us with some detail. So those were all about how do we keep caregivers out of prison, the ones before, the South African example, the Malawian example, very important because it often gets lost. And states, for example, were keen to report on this. I think we got more responses on this part of the questionnaires from states than any other. And it was because they were keen to tell us about their special mother and baby units, about how well they're doing and how happy the babies are and how great it all was. But very few states go that one step back, which is to say, let's not imprison primary caregivers of children. That's what the general comment of the African Committee says, and that is a very important feature, and it's where we should be putting our focus. Let's not only think about improving the conditions for children, although it's important if they are in prison with their caregivers, but let's be more ambitious and try and keep caregivers out of prison. But Mauritius gave us some interesting, very detailed information, and including the fact that children in prison with mothers attend pre-primary school in the community and participate in community activities. The DRC indicated that they don't generally permit children to live in prison with their mothers, but that courts do consider the fact that a mother has a child or children at bail, at sentencing, and parole. However, we need to be careful that that isn't just relegated to just one of the factors that get considered. I think what has to be understood about why the case of S versus M was so special was that it completely changed the game. It said that from now on, you actually cannot sentence a primary caregiver unless you have shown that you have applied your mind to the impact that that will have on the best interests of the children concerned. I'm shifting now to migration. Now, here we got very limited feedback from states, generally, but especially in the SADC region. So this appears to be an area where states are a little bit less comfortable to talk about. The study includes some information from the Human Rights Council report, which indicates that the use of detention of migrant children is widespread in some countries in this region. South Africa, in their report, did say that their national law and policy prevents children in situations of migration from being deprived of their liberty. But the fact is that there are sometimes incidents where children do turn up in police cells and do turn up in detention centers, and so that needs to be looked at. And also, I think the actual care that children receive in shelters, particularly near the border areas, is something that's been well documented and can also get more attention. One very interesting little detail that cropped up is Mayotte. Now, Mayotte, no one in this region is responsible for Mayotte, but oddly enough, it is in this region. It's near Madagascar and Mozambique, but it belongs to France. It's a department of France. Now, we received information from NGOs based in France who have been working with children in this region, and these are children in situations of migration, and they are reporting very high levels of detention there. So that is definitely something that needs more of a look at, and I would say this is where UN agencies, UN bodies, treaty bodies as well, should be having a look to see what's happening. Now, children in institutions, and you'll see it's described here as a complex area of the global study, as it is difficult to define the line between alternative care and deprivation of liberty. And I think we already heard from questions that Manfred was asked. This really was a difficult chapter, and I had the privilege and the challenge to lead this chapter together with Leslie du Toit, who is here, and Zita Hansungule, and the Centre for Child Law at the University of Pretoria led on this chapter. We had a very interesting 2-day meeting in Pretoria dealing with this difficult issue. One of the things that Manfred taught me during our many discussions about this topic was that these issues of whether children in their own homes are deprived of their liberty, or whether you're living in an open institution but you have to be in by 6, that these are actually restrictions on your freedom of movement, right? And that as your restrictions on your freedom of movement accumulate, they eventually become deprivation of liberty. And that's why it's so difficult to draw a line, because these things mount up to a point, and it's not so easy. It's not so much about the clanking of the key in the door. It's actually more about how the people living in that place feel. And it would, as Manfred mentioned, would have been easier in a way to be able to say, look, if it's a big institution, you must close it down, but if it's small, you can keep. But that's not really what it's about. It's about changing the whole mindset. There were also some strong advocates for the idea that there should be that a child should never be placed outside of a family situation. And although the global study goes very far down the line of saying that family is always best for children, that we must make every possible effort that we can to keep children in their families or in other families if they can't stay in their own family. But at the end of the day, I think the global study recognizes that there is a space for appropriate, high-quality alternative care in certain situations. And one of the reasons why that's so important, I think, is because the voices of children themselves must be given weight. And some children may choose that over living in a substitute family, which some children who've gone through several foster care placements, for example, might feel. I could actually spend an hour on that, but I won't. I'm going to go forward and just tell you that one of the things that made it so tricky to gather information about institutions is that it covers so much. It's not only, we immediately think of children's homes or orphanages, whatever you want to call them, but it's also children who are in mental health institutions. There are children in drug rehabilitation institutions. There are children in religious institutions in many countries in Africa where they are completely deprived of their liberty. And as Manfred pointed out, many of these will not be counted because the state doesn't place a child in a religious institution. A family does. But those children are still deprived of their liberty, but we probably haven't counted them because we were working with a legal definition. Fortunately, we had a very involved NGO, the Lumos Foundation, and they provided support for a parallel study on which the global study was able to draw, but also they used some of the data from the global study, so it was a good partnership. And they have a comprehensive study that is forthcoming, authored by Chris Desmond and Chunling Liu, which will be called Estimating the Number of Children Living in Institutional Care Globally. The global study team has pulled out the numbers from those figures that they've produced, which are actually 2015 numbers. And these are based on official figures plus grey literature, plus household surveys and everything that they could find. And maybe what's important about it is to show how difficult it is working with numbers. Because you'll see on the right-hand side, it talks about institutionalization rates. And this is per 100,000 children in the particular state, right? And so we see, for example, that it's in the descending order of institutionalization. But if you run your eyes down the column on the left, we've got Seychelles with only 69 children, but they're 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6th on the list in terms of institutionalization rate, because for their population of children, they've got quite a high rate. Now, it's always risky putting up numbers. I'm almost certain that somebody will want to meet me at lunchtime. You're welcome to come and meet me at lunchtime and tell me that one of these numbers is wrong. But maybe rather than focusing so much on the numbers, it's quite interesting to see that if we had comparable data that we could rely on and that we all agreed on, we could do so much, because we would then be able to see what it means to work out an institutionalization rate. So in terms of institutions, what promising practices? Well, social safety net programs, prevention of children ever coming into contact with care and protection systems, for example, is very, very important. And here we see, for example, two good examples that reported to the global study. Tanzania reported on their social action fund, which in addition to microcredit and cash transfers is being increasingly applied to vulnerable households, and this has the effect of children being able to stay with families even in situations of poverty. In South Africa, the child support grant is paid to over 12 million beneficiaries, and research, there's been quite a lot of research here, that has shown that the grant really does promote children's health and well-being, but it needs to be seen as part of a broader social flaw. It can't be seen in isolation. But if it goes together with things like access to free education, if it goes along with things like access to school feeding and free healthcare up to a certain age and so on, then you're beginning to create a protective framework that is truly preventive. So it was good that there were some examples from the region, and these actually float up in the big global study as well. South Africa offered the example of the Isibindi project, a family strengthening approach in which child and youth care workers work on the ground and in the communities with children, with targeting children who are at risk to keep them in their families, to try and see what the issues are that their families are dealing with, link them to services and support, and so working with children in their own life space as well as their families. In Mauritius reported that they have had a drive for deinstitutionalization, and as part of this, they've been focusing on different models of foster care, including professional foster care, and they say that they work in multi-agency teams in order to provide strong support to families to ensure the stability of those placements. Moving on now then to children in armed conflict. Well, from Africa we received information about children being detained by government forces and armed groups in Cameroon, DRC, Mali, Nigeria, that should be Niger, Nigeria, Somalia, and South Sudan. And from this region, therefore, DRC is the only one. What we did hear from DRC is that the Ministry of Defense issued a directive prohibiting government armed forces from recruiting children and from detaining them on suspicion of being involved with the non-state armed forces. And they have directed that children should be referred to child protection agencies. However, the Committee on the Rights of the Child has raised concerns more recently in 2017 about the continued detention of children suspected of being associated with armed groups. So obviously, it's work in progress, but it's good that we've got some information from the DRC and that there's ongoing dialogue about that. So to conclude then, I think what's very important to recognize is that there is inadequate data from this region. Very difficult to base anything comparative on because you can't, unless you're sure that everything's being collected in the same way, then you really can't be sure if you can compare it. So I think this is actually hugely important that the states in this region start cooperating in thinking about how to collect data, how to capture it, how to compare it, how to analyze it, because we'll be able to do so much more if we know that. So for those countries that did go to the trouble of filling in the questionnaire, please continue, but we would like all the other states to also continue, or to start now and to continue, to collect the relevant information on children and to keep it and to analyze it. States are also able to request UN technical assistance from the relevant UN agencies, and this could be used to develop data systems and also to facilitate cross-country learning, to make sure that any learnings can be adapted to suit local situations. And I can tell you from our side that the Committee on the Rights of the Child will be using the global study as state parties report to us in order to look for what was reported in there on the states, but also to ask states about their progress, what are they doing in terms of children deprived of their liberty, and giving them recommendations. And we might well also be directing states to seek technical assistance where we think that that is warranted. Thank you.